Well, we have lots to talk about. So we're going to spend a few minutes speaking among ourselves here, trying to touch on some of the major challenging issues, and then we'll have plenty of time for audience participation. I don't know where to start. There's so many places to start. Let's start with access. We heard from Lori this morning that everybody at Dana-Farber has genetic testing and for their tumor, and that is, as we've heard throughout the day, incredibly critical for getting the right treatment to the right patient at the right time. We heard from Carl about this amazing new CAR T-cell therapy, but then we saw this map, and we see that just from a geographic location globally, it's not available around the world. And when we look at the complexity of delivering that care, it's not available in our community settings and lots of places where patients get their care. So let's talk about the challenge of access from these perspectives. What do you see? How do you see the level of access for these great new approaches to date? And what are the barriers, and what are some of the solutions that we might put into place to make access more broad?
So just from the genomics angle, I think there are a couple of confounders that I can talk about just briefly. One is really physician education. So, to really make the access more broad, I think we have to, and this is happening for physicians in training right now in medical school, but for those practitioners in oncology that have been out in the field 20 plus years, for example, their level of comfort with cancer genomics is probably not really there. So that's an education issue that I think remains unsolved at this point in time. Once you can, sort of overcome that, I think the other aspect that is still, a bit in question, although this is beginning to fall with large-scale efforts like Lori talked about at the Dana-Farber, like at Memorial Sloan Kettering, where they've now tested, I think, over 50,000 patients in a similar way, et cetera, is really showing the clinical benefit or clinical utility that this type of profiling actually brings to patients and brings to outcomes. So I think that's another thing that's kind of there. It's being proven over and over again. I think more in the more frequent cancers like melanoma, lung cancer, et cetera, and over time in the less frequent cancers. So that's still waiting to happen, and I think those are two pillars that need to fall before we can really see this being offered more broadly. I think the last thing just to mention is that the analysis of these data is not always straightforward. And so I've really personally been trying to champion the availability of more online tools so that if you had the results from testing, you would be readily able to interpret those in light of not only the mutations, but also the drugs and even clinical trials that match up with those.
Yep, make it more user-friendly.
Exactly.
Yep. What about thinking about patients that might be eligible CAR T-cell therapy, but are living in rural and frontier locations, even in the United States, and don't have ready access? How do you see this this really important new approach become more available to people?
So, Mary, there's a scale-out issue both from the manufacturing side. Novartis has one manufacturing plant right now, Gilead one on the West Coast, Novartis on the East Coast, and right now it's like a FedEx process, very complex logistics. So that will be built out over time, and I think very rapidly, so that the geographic issues can be solved that way. I think the cost of goods is a major issue right now, and that will probably come down by an order of magnitude with engineering efforts that are underway to automate it. But the time scale of how fast that happens is really unknown. And the big unknown also is whether the third party or so-called off-the-shelf cells might work. And if that can really happen, where it would take out the step of the autologous, it would make it much more like standard pharmacology in the pharmaceutical industry, where cells would be in place at hospitals, and it could be both at community hospitals as well as tertiary cancer centers.
Zeke Emanuel published an opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal last month saying that at Penn that the actual cost of goods was $60,000. Is that an accurate number?
So we have looked very carefully, Lee. So there's, first of all, you have to remember in an academic center where there's no profit, there's no depreciation of, the buildings and so on. And actually, FDA standards for a commercial scale facility are different than from an academic facility. So we have our manufacturing process at the University of Pennsylvania is $54,000. So Zeke was very close on that. There's also costs that we don't talk about, which are, following the patients. We, follow genetically the cells in the patient. That requires assays that aren't covered by current reimbursement. And then there is, in the case of a gene transfer, the FDA, we used to have the RAC committee, that all recombinant protocols went through. Now, we have a 15-year follow-up mandate where the patients on gene-modified cells are followed, to see is there issues of genotoxicity and so on. So that adds more cost to this than other therapies.
We started talking about value, and I was reminded of a quote by Warren Buffett: "Price is what you pay, and value is what you get." And I think we've got maybe a disconnect between price and value, as you were pointing out. So let's talk about that a little bit. We have some transformational therapies that clearly, they're expensive, but they're literally saving lives. And then we have a number of therapies that are maybe the same price, but we're achieving, increase in length of life 1, 2, 3 months. Speak a little bit about how we should be tackling this. What kind of framework should we be using to try and address and define value? It's certainly true that value is in the eye of the beholder to some extent. There are a lot of different stakeholders here, from the patient's perspective, from the payer perspective, from the physician perspective, from the community perspective, from the societal perspective. Everybody would look at this slightly differently. So how do we move forward? What do you suggest as a next step?
Who knows? So I think, first of all, I think we should dispense with this idea that value is in the eye of the beholder. I do think the math is a little tricky. Like, do we want to really pay added incentives to treat rare diseases, which will crowd out spending on, widespread conditions? But, remember, like this box, this is all about where we want to place the incentives to pull innovation into those spaces. But these are with the exception of the extremely wealthy people, these are shared social resources. And whether it flows through a commercial insurance plan, through premiums out of employers' pockets, or through taxation, either state or federal, it's all collective resources. And so we are making only one allocation decision, and it's from only one perspective, which is society's. And so we need to decide, each incremental dollar in a CAR-T comes out of education or smoking cessation or infrastructure or whatever it is, and that's how we have to think about this calculus. And the interested parties are always over-interested, and so they are bad stakeholders. And I know this because my subway stop is terrible in New York, and I just wish Governor Cuomo would pay attention to it. And he apparently is busy doing other stuff, but my subway stop matters the most. And so we need to think about this as, where we use these money. And, just to give you a sense, the U.S. revenues for Keytruda were 4.5 immunotherapy that mostly used to treat lung cancer, fabulous treatment, were 4.5 times total U.S. investment in smoking cessation and prevention last year. So that's how we're allocating. And that's a social decision, and I think it's not optimal, but it doesn't matter, there's a lot of stakeholders.
So, don't you dare go for a smoke after this.
I'm running in 2020, that's all I hear. Dude.
From a policy...
Subway stop was in the eye of the beholder, though, there is there's something there.
Yeah,
that was meant with sarcasm in mind, of course. It's a beautiful stuff.
Lee.
So from a policy standpoint, where we were slightly different is you would set the value by formula, some process at initial market, and I was going to have the value come down much quicker because competition would start at a much sooner time frame. Do you have a feeling for which one might be better in the long run?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the idea is that value sets the most important place to set the price is when a drug has a pure monopoly and there's no competition. I think competition underneath it, like the ALK space or something like that, still makes a lot of sense. But we're looking at things like Orkambi for cystic fibrosis, which is not a particularly good drug, costs a tremendous amount of money, has no competition, and Medicaid programs by law have to pay for it.
So the question then is, what's that formula?
Yeah.
And having wrestled with that as long as Peter has, I don't think there's going to ever be consensus that eventually somebody's going to have to by fiat say, this is it. And the way I envision that happening is we get to a crisis point and somebody is forced to make the decision, because we'll have an awful lot of committees debating it until then. We already do. We have a vast literature on how to set value. I would want to make one point, though. When pharma argues this position, they say that we should collect all of the value that's a benefit from this drug. That means lost wages of the spouse who's taking care of me, transportation to the hospital. And so it's used as an argument to bring that price up further and further. And my argument about new technology is it should, in fact, be gain-saving, not capturing everything that was lost before. And even getting that concession would be a tough first start, but I think a good one.
Thinking about, just for a particular disease indication, the number of therapies that are out there still approved. How do we as a society, or how do we in our clinics make the right decisions about what therapy to use? And how do we eliminate the ones that are less effective than others from the options that are out there available?
So I'll start. One is you have to have some data. We have some good information about effectiveness from registration trials and from guidelines like the NCCN. But one of the things that I was doing as I left United was we were beginning to use a combination of claims data and clinical data to actually do comparative effectiveness studies to show what the total cost of care was, what the toxicities were, hospitalizations mostly, and how long the patient was able to stay on the medicine as a proxy for basically response rate. And I've been surprised that you can get fairly good directional information on that. You can't tell the difference between two relatively close drug regimens, but there are some pretty big outliers on there. Either they're way more expensive with similar results, or they're way less effective, and we weed those out with data. CMS could do that very easily by just simply collecting a little clinical information when the patient first goes on trial or on therapy of any kind. They can use the claims data to get the rest. It will not be at the level of an FDA registration trial, no question about that. But I think directionally it could help force out some of the less effective performing drugs or regimens.
Why do you think we haven't done that yet?
It's hard. I think secondly, the whole notion of taking a drug away is viewed as a negative, even if the drug regimen isn't particularly effective. We found that out 2 decades ago with breast cancer and bone marrow transplantation. There was a lot of resistance by payers to pay for it because the evidence wasn't in. It was much too early. Legislatively, coverage was pushed for and basically mandated, and then the randomized trial came out showing that it was in fact harmful. So because it might have promise, it was viewed as promising, and not paying for it was a takeaway. And that's tough to do politically.
I think it might be also a little bit more nuanced than that, because typically to get on a drug, you have to have a companion diagnostic that sort of, in the current space, goes to one gene, one drug sorts of combinations. Whereas we understand that, for example, many TKIs are what we call dirty. They actually hit multiple kinase targets, not just a single one. And to a first approximation, every patient's cancer genome is very different. So if you're just testing for the one target, there are other things that you're sort of not seeing that might actually mean that it's not not a good drug. It's just not a good drug in the context of that patient's genotype, but you've only looked at one thing to get them onto the therapy. So that may be another reason why it hasn't been done, just because there are underlying nuances that could, switch the balance of efficacy, I guess. Yeah.
When we look at now our much greater ability to look at what patient outcomes are actually on an individual and on a population basis, why don't we adopt outcomes-based pricing? What are the pros and cons of that? I mean, people argue on both sides of that. Speak a little bit more about that.
Well, as I mentioned, so outcomes contracts, the notion is, the general structure of them is pay what the pharmaceutical company wants to charge, but if the drug doesn't work, maybe you get your money back or some fraction. And that, even if you subtract out that refund, it doesn't drive the effective price, minus the refund, to a price that makes health economic sense, because the pharmaceutical company is still in complete control of the price it starts at. And in fact, they may even be in more control because they've got this sort of back end, late night TV salesman kind of, oh, don't worry, if you don't like it, you get your money back anyway, kind of approach to it. But, it's sort of nutty. I can't believe it's taken up any traction, because insurers are in the portfolio business anyway. They're used to paying 10 times when the drug only works 6 times. That's how the math works. And the best data you're going to have on a drug, until we get to Lee's version of the world where we actually follow people carefully, is the ex-ante price, the price you have at the time the drug's approved based on that data. And that's value-based pricing, anchors to there. And then sure, over time, if there's really robust data showing the drug works better or works differently in a different indication, it could have a different price. But these outcomes contracts, it's mostly a ruse around, oh, we're doing something about value that's somehow increasing our top line. But it's also, there's a whole regulatory angle there too. They're Medicaid best price, anti-kickback. There's some other stuff they seek to get out of this. And so they're saying we have to do this to get this regulatory relaxation. They wanted long before they even came up with this latest idea.
We're going to continue this discussion, but I want to invite people in the audience to move to the microphone so we can have some Q&A as well. And I figure there might be some people coming, so hang tight. In the medical world and in the scientific world and in our clinical trials, we're always looking very carefully at toxicities when we're testing new drugs and adverse events. And I think one of the things that is becoming more and more apparent in the current climate is there's a type of toxicity, financial toxicity, that we haven't actually really measured in our trials, but now we're seeing the great impact on patients. So from your experience, talk a little bit about how that financial toxicity really impacts patients day to day in their real lives, and it's more than just their checkbook.
They're walking away. They're deciding they can't have therapy, and it's very real. I think as you talk about that subject, we really have 2 populations in this country. The National Bureau of Economic Research said that 50% of Americans can't get their hands on $2,000 with 30 days notice. That's half of us. So when you tell those people that they've got a $5,000 deductible on their health plan, they aren't getting therapy. So if we want to go to totally free care, we have to be willing to pay the price for that, and it will be immense. And we have to get the cost of that health care down, which we're not really addressing either one. We're not too terribly willing to be taxed, and we haven't been able to address pricing yet. So as Peter has said in his remarks, these are policy decisions. That's what we've been willing to tolerate today, and we would have to, as a nation, decide that we have different priorities than we have today. That one's hard.
Other comments?
No, I agree with Lee. We've decided markets tend to be regressive, and the more we adopt a market-based solution for pricing, the more regressive it will become. And that this financial toxicity is just, that's a provocative term for increasing copays and coinsurance and sticking it to poor people. And that's what we've decided, which is why we have such terrible access problems. But at the upper end of the distribution, we probably still have, world-class access. And it's a matter of policy. That's what we've decided. I, again, find it highly undesirable as an outcome, but that it's not an accident. It didn't fall out of the sky.
Questions? Let's start over here.
Alex Capron, USC. I wanted to thank the whole panel. I think it's been great that we've gotten to these kinds of practical issues beyond the scientific issues as well. But I want to follow up with Peter with two quick questions. One is, does the experience in Oregon with their health plan, which was intended to be a values-based, give you any concern? And the concern arises because you yourself anticipated that we're talking about comparative values with all the other things that the whole pot of money could be spent for. And that means that there are going to be patients with cancer who could be treated, but the cost is such that the value calculation doesn't compare to the other uses of dollars. And then we end up with the rescue phenomenon, the individual patient, front page of the newspaper, all the story. The second question has to do with how are these values going to be determined within the area of cancer treatment? Is there a hypothetical patient, no other disease? What age? A 10-year-old with leukemia with a 60, 70, 80-year lifespan ahead if cured, or the 60, 70, 80-year-old that we were hearing ought to now be eligible for cancer treatment. The value in those two situations, is it the value of life, the inherent, inestimable value of life, or is it so much value in working life, productive life, social life, et cetera, et cetera?
Sure. Yeah, okay. So related questions, I think, but so what I'm talking about at least is that the problem we're trying to solve around does not assume that, let's say, prices of pharmaceuticals are immutable. Rather, they are very much a product of the marketplace. And so, in other countries, drugs cost less, not because they're cheaper to make, it's because the tolerance of those governments is not as high. And so, Oregon, I don't want to really delve too deeply into Oregon, but it's proof that, politics is hard, and taking away things from people is hard. And if you don't have enough market leverage, you can't get price concessions. But the notion here is we need the incentives aligned. I do agree, it's hard to figure out what the math is. How much is one drug worth compared to another one? But it's not impossible, and it's certainly better than the current monopoly-driven system.
Thanks, Peter. We have so many people waiting in line, so I want to ask the people asking questions to be crisp and us to be crisp as well, so we can get as many of your questions in as possible. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm Bill Hazard, that nagging geriatrician, and I'm listening, and I'm missing quality of life, years adjusted cost. That's an old concept, 25 years old at least. Does it still apply?
I think that's a great question, and it's part of that. What is in the bucket of things that we look to when we talk about value? So, comments.
Only that it doesn't apply today because of the reasons we talked about with the mandates. The classic examples are Latinib for pancreas cancer. 0.5 months progression-free survival, worthless drug, but it had to be paid for. So we are not willing yet as a society to say, here's what the quality maximum limit will be for cancer. That's the political decision we're wrestling with.
So CVS just announced they're offering a formulary that uses a quality cutoff, not for breakthrough therapies, but for all other therapies. I can't remember if it's 100,000 per quality or 150, but maybe it's making its way into the public sphere.
And they're probably only going to be able to do that for self-funded plans. Absolutely. Because everybody else is legislated. So,
thank you.
Yeah, it'll be a great experiment to find out, though. Yeah.
John Gardner, I'm one of the rare scientists who comes from a Doctor of Business Administration background. But to me, you can't hear me? I thought that I was talking pretty loud. All right. John Gardner, DBA, scientific career. One of the most ridiculous things that I've ever come across, and I don't know any way about it, is to look at economics in terms of dollars and cents. I'm also an ethicist, and I tend to think in terms of human costs. at least 50% of the population can't afford medical costs, particularly if they have ongoing conditions and if we go back to not paying for pre-existing conditions, which for elderly people is all of us. But in any case, it isn't just the cost to the individual. That cost to the individual spreads out to the family. So included in the cost is the loss of the home, the decrease in the children's education, and therefore their future economic contribution to the society as a whole. The burden on neighbors, because in most low-price communities, the way they get by is people help each other. So that's taking a lot of effort and concern and care away, not just from family, but from neighbors in the community. Does anybody care or attempt to go at this? I can ask that question because I've had to do, back when I was doing some work, one of the things I did was life cycle cost analysis of advanced weapons systems. And we were costing a lot of things that you couldn't put a dollar value on. But so there is such a thing as value economics. But does anybody work on that or care about that in healthcare?
I'm going to ask our distinguished panelists to comment on this important point.
I think the answer is absolutely yes,
Absolutely
which
yes.
is why
Yes.
all four of us are up here. I'm counting wrong. I'm not an economist. 5 of us. Anybody who's taking care of patients, and we all have, understand that and are just as concerned as you are in trying to do something about it. But that will take a whole nation of consensus to get it done.
Does that mean we just don't look at it because we can declare the problem unsolvable at the beginning, so we don't need to...
Not at all.
No, I think
okay.
we're here because we believe it's soluble.
Right, exactly.
Absolutely, and lots of people looking at that. Patient, I think the interesting thing now that's happening in the cancer space is that people really are looking at not just the tumor, but the whole patient, and not just the patient, but everyone who touches the patient, including the patient's community.
Roy Jensen, University of Kansas Cancer Center. As Dr. Newcomer pointed out, there's an extensive literature on calculating value. But I think one of our fundamental problems is that at every opportunity that I'm aware of, our Congress has refused to allow this type of data to be utilized to allocate resources. And so, given that fact, and I don't think Congress is going to become more functional anytime soon, how do we bypass them to solve this issue? Because this seems to be the fundamental problem.
That's yours.
Yeah, right. Vote.
Everyone wants that question.
I think you have to be optimistic on the long-term horizon that they won't maintain this level of dysfunction. There are you could create incentives and various structures that could encourage this kind of pricing approach without legislation, but it's going to be extremely difficult. So this is maybe we'll get to a crisis so that you can find articles from 20 years ago saying the healthcare system is about to go to the...
And the more general question is, what are the pros and cons of having the government really enter into these price negotiations in a significant way? You've written about that.
Well, I would prefer that it be done at the community level rather than a national level, but I'm afraid it will take a crisis that will then be addressed at the national level and not addressed well because of the urgency. We need to start that discussion at the community level today. And one of the things I have noticed about this election, at least in our area, is the town hall meetings are getting some discussion about healthcare now, which is good. Roy, given the people that run in your state, I don't think it'll ever happen, but it's certainly possible.
weren't going to mention that, Lisa.
But it is possible, and we're going to have to. There's a story I tell that when I was chairing Park Nicola, it's a 1,000-physician group. We sent 10 physicians over to Sweden to start learning about budget health care. In other words, how to do it with a universal budget. And in Sweden, each hospital district gets a fixed amount of money, and they decide how to spend it as a community. On rounds, we found a stage 4 colon cancer patient, and the discussion came up, they don't screen for colon cancer in Sweden. They spend money tacking down rugs, by the way, because the hip fracture rate was so high, but they just didn't feel it was cost effective. Well, our surgeon went ballistic, yelled, screamed, went crazy, and the Swedish doctor let him finish, and then he said, yeah, but in Sweden, everybody has health insurance and no one is homeless. Touché. So we've got to have this discussion.
Kevin Volpe, University of Pennsylvania. There's a bit of an interesting paradox here, because I think a lot of people had sticker shock when the CAR T therapies came out with a price of $500,000. But when you step back and you think about conventional thresholds in terms of quality-adjusted life years and how effective those therapies are, you could actually argue in a U.S. context that price is still a bargain. Now, the problem I think many policy people really struggle with, though, is that we have a lot of drugs that are $100,000, $150,000, extend life for a few months. Medicare doesn't consider cost and coverage decisions, and we borrow $1.2 trillion a year. What do you see as changing that dynamic? I think this should be less about the absolute price, and as Peter was saying, it's really about the value, and in particularly the lower value treatments, which we pay an awful lot for. What's going to change that either in the private sector or the public sector?
I don't have a good answer, but I'm really glad you mentioned that this is an allocation problem first and foremost, not a total spending problem. And you're absolutely right that the analysis of the CAR T therapies, particularly in the kids and young adults ALL indication, look quite favorable. They do depend heavily on an assumption of kind of long-term trajectory that hasn't been observed yet. But it seems that is probably, if we're going to spend our money in a rational way, that's one of the places we'd want to spend it.
We have time for just one more question over here.
Okay, Oliver Fine from Weill Cornell in Manhattan. I was interested in the panel's reflection on the fact that there is more political discussion in the community about healthcare reform. Sometimes this is, Medicare for all or a single-payer system. In the state of New York, our assembly passed a single-payer bill 2-1 just this past June. Is there any comment on the panel side about the value potentially of seeing a single-payer approach to our healthcare system?
Right. Okay. I have some pretty strong feelings here. Having run a hospital and physician organization, when I saw a Medicare patient and spent $1 taking care of them, the government paid me about 80 cents. Okay? So I lost money every time I saw a Medicare patient. I made up for that by overcharging Blue Cross Blue Shield, right? I charged them a lot more money. They make up that deficit. It's basically a hidden tax. If we go to single payer, which assumes that everybody goes on Medicare, we're going to have provider organizations all over the United States filing bankruptcy or asking for financial relief because we don't pay what it really costs today. Now, you might argue, okay, they'll lower costs, but they aren't going to be able to do that overnight. They can't get rid of their buildings. They have an infrastructure that is expensive. So we're going to have to pay more if we go to a single-payer system, substantially more. And that means substantially more taxes. That would be really significant. And that's what's being ignored in this political debate today. Medicare sounds easy because we are ignoring the fact that it's compensated or it's made up for by private employers who are overpaying for their services. So that part of the discussion's got to happen. I'm really going to be curious to see what happens to New York.
But the administrative costs of hospitals in this country are about 25%, and in Canada they're 12%. The difference is that you have to, in fact, deal with these multiple payers, all of whom impose a profit in their process as well. I think that, in fact, we could move to a system that was much more efficient. It's estimated that $500 billion goes into administrative costs that could, in fact, be removed from our system.
I think that one of the things that is abundantly clear from this discussion is that there's a lot more discussion that everybody would like to have. I was told no more. I think I want to thank everybody. I'm so sorry that we didn't get everybody up to who wanted to ask the question. I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank Carl for providing, through University of Pennsylvania, the video of Emily Whitehead that we showed, and also thank all of you for your participation. This is obviously a place where the P word is partnership, and I think we need partnerships in order to go forward, bringing our scientists together with our policymakers, with our clinicians, with our communities, with our patients, and with our doctors. And it's only going to be through this kind of heartfelt dialogue with lots of communication and discussion and debate that we're going to be able to target and tackle some of these very challenging questions that we've discussed today. I think we're at a crisis, and I just don't understand why people don't realize that we are in crisis and requiring dialogue now. So thank you to everybody.
Thank you.